Part 38. The Liu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 371. Chapter 371 He is mine. Zhang Wanan was sent to school by Tang Yu as usual after breakfast. Luzes who didn't wait at the door this time. They talked on the phone at home in the morning. Luzes who had something to do this morning, so he had to come early, so he couldn't wait for her too long. At the school gate, Zhang Wanan remembered that Luzes who didn't even eat breakfast this morning. But after looking around, there were no small shops, only a few small stalls. Zhang Wanan thought for a while and walked over to find a relatively clean stall. She bought a pancake and a cup of porridge and entered the school in her hands. She walked straight into the high school building. She knew which classroom on which floor Luzes who was on, but she had never been in before and this was her first time. I feel a little uneasy when I say it. The senior high school is different from the junior high school, especially the seniors who are preparing for the college entrance examination. From the window, they are all buried in the pile of books. Zhang Wanan went directly to the second floor without stopping too much. From time to time, a few people would pass by in the corridor. When they saw Zhang Wanan, a new face, they couldn't help but take a few more glances. Zhang Wanan kept his head down and didn't dare to raise it. Afraid of being discovered, giving away a meal is like committing a thief. Zhang Wanan came to Luzes whose classroom and stood by the window and looked around. She didn't know why there were only a dozen or so people in their classroom, and the other students didn't know where they were. Zhang Wanan glanced around and saw Luzes who in the middle of the front row. He was sitting in the middle, surrounded by 5 or 6 people, both men and women, who seemed to be discussing something. Zhang Wanan squinted her eyes for a while, and suddenly realized that the girl closest to Luzes who was actually Avril, and she was back. Zhang Wanan felt uncomfortable when he saw her. He bit his lip hard but didn't know what to do. Looking at the rice in his hand, Zhang Wanan remembered that he was not here to check the post, but to deliver food. She wanted to knock on the door but was afraid that too many people would find her or disturb their discussion. When she was thinking about what to do, a gust of wind blew by. Zhang Wanan quickly grabbed the wind with her quick eyes and hands. The wind turned around with a puzzled look on his face. Is something wrong? Zhang Wanan saw that he was about to enter the classroom, and also the classroom where Luzes who was sitting, as if he was grabbing a life-saving straw. Classmate, can you help me call Luzes who? The Feng looked her up and down a few times, and finally his eyes fell on her hand holding the rice, sighing helplessly, and then shouted into the classroom, "Monitor, someone is looking for her." Zhang Wanan could see that the way he looked at her was filled with disgust, and he probably thought she was Luzes who's suitor. It seems that Luzes who has many suitors, and they are so many that his classmates are helpless and bored. Zhang Wanan thanked Feng and let him go in. Luzes who in the classroom heard the sound and looked up at the door, but found nothing there. It happened that brother Feng patted his shoulder when he passed by to express his helplessness. Luzes who felt something in his hands. He did not go out directly, but looked around at the people around him. "I'll go." Avril immediately understood what he meant and volunteered. Luzes who didn't say anything and let Avril go out. After Avril went out, she was a little confused when she saw a familiar shadow with its back turned to her. However, she did not investigate who the owner of this shadow was. Maybe he had come to pester Luzes who several times, so she remembered it, so she was very upset. He said hello politely. Zhang Wanan froze when he heard the voice, and didn't even turn around to say hello. "Sister, go back, Luzes who is mine. Study hard and don't disturb him, otherwise don't blame me for being rude." Avril's voice was still saying behind her. Zhang Wanan rolled his eyes and felt that his thoughts were going through his mind thousands of times. End of this chapter. The Liu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 372. Chapter 372, Keep distance from her. She doesn't know what the situation is now, but she wants to find out the situation. Jongwanan took a deep breath, turned around, looked at Avril with a smile and said, "Hello, Sister Avril, you are back." Avril was stunned when she saw it was her. She was obviously stunned. "Anan?" she called out. Jongwanan nodded, shook the breakfast in his hand and said, "I'm here to deliver food to Luz's who. He didn't eat in the morning." Avril smiled awkwardly for a moment. She explained with a forced smile, "I thought it was one of Zizhu's suitors. I originally wanted to persuade him to leave, but I didn't expect it was you. I'll call him for you." Then she took a few steps back and called Luz's who. Luz's who heard the voice and looked over and found Avril's expression was complicated. Luz's who stood up and told everyone, "You guys watch first, I'll go out and take a look." He thought Avril was not settled this time. But when he went out and saw Jongwanan standing at the door, he was a little stunned. "Anan, why are you here?" Jongwanan looked at him and took a deep breath, pursed her lips and smiled at him. "It's surprising, isn't it?" Luz's who looked back at Avril and found that she had already retreated behind him. "You go in first, I'll talk to Anan for a while," he said. Avril hurriedly explained before leaving, "I didn't know it was Anan, I thought, I didn't say anything." "Get in." Avril didn't talk any more nonsense and turned around and entered the classroom. "Anan?" Luz's who called out softly when Avril entered and asked, "She didn't say anything to you this time, did she?" Jongwanan shook his head. Avril was indeed not talking nonsense this time. "I'm here to bring you a meal, why don't you come out by yourself?" she asked, putting the meal into Luz's who's hand. "I didn't expect you to come, I thought it was," Luz's who said with a helpless smile. Jongwanan also smiled and said, "Sister Avril is here to chase suitors for you, right?" "A few times occasionally," Luz's who answered honestly. "It's pretty good too." Jongwanan smiled softly, a bit self-deprecating. She guessed that Avril's pursuit of Luz's who's suitor was not for her, but for herself, otherwise how could she come out to offend others? "Are you jealous?" Luz's who asked. "That's right, it's not that stingy." He said this, but actually he felt a little uncomfortable in his heart. "Don't think too much. I have always kept a distance from her. This time I am helping the teacher make something," Luz's who said and glanced at the few people in the classroom who were still looking at the things on the table seriously. Jongwanan knew that he was busy, so he said, "Then I won't disturb you. You can go in quickly. If you still have food, eat it quickly. It will be cold soon. You're so good, you even know how to bring me food." Luz's who looked at her with doting eyes and reached out to touch her head. Jongwanan turned her head slightly to avoid it. She looked around and said, "Pay attention." "Okay." Although Luz's who said this, he still touched her hair dishonestly. Jongwanan straightened her messy hair with a look of helplessness on her face. "After you leave, remember to eat," Jongwanan ordered. "Okay, I'll come a few more times and pick you up personally," Luz's who said with a smile. "What a beautiful idea," Jongwanan snorted and disappeared around the corner. Luz's who watched him immediately return to the classroom, but when he put the food in, someone teased him. "The squad leader is collecting the little girl's things," it was the windy man just now. "Monitor, that girl outside, are you attracted to her?" "Squad leader, you've already accepted someone else's food, so you must have taken a fancy to them." Even so, he even ran out in person. Seeing that the more he spoke, the more outrageous he became, Luz's who shouted and they shut up in silence. On the other hand, Avril's face has not looked good since she came in, and her hands were clenched tightly. End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yun. Chapter 373. Chapter 373 Falling in Love. But loses who ignored her. I'll have a meal first, and you guys will keep an eye on it, loses who said. Everyone was really shocked at this time, and all looked at loses who was their aloof squad leader. Not only did he accept the girls' food, but he also ate it. Is the squad leader in love? Someone asked in a low voice. Then there was a tisk-tisk sound. Loses who only glanced at it and said nothing, but Avril shouted. Stop gossiping, finish it quickly and send it to the teacher. I need it urgently. Her face was not very good, and her voice was raised several pitches. Everyone looked at me, I looked at you, and finally looked at Avril and sighed inwardly. Anyone with a discerning eye can see Avril Lavigne's feelings for loses who. Now that loses who seems to have a crush on her, Avril Lavigne must feel uncomfortable. Jongwon had just turned the stairs and walked only a few steps when he ran into Lao Lu, one of the three giants coming towards him. The moment Jongwon saw him, she was a little panicked, especially after meeting his eyes. She originally wanted to turn around and run away, but she thought that Lao Lu would have no impression of her, so she boldly walked past him. Jongwon breathed a sigh of relief the moment they passed each other. The moment she breathed out, she thought that everything would be fine, but it was not the case. Lao Lu, who passed by her, suddenly looked through the gap in the railing. Classmate, he shouted. Jongwon's body stiffened when he called him, and she looked up. Hello, teacher, Jongwon greeted with a smile. You look familiar. When Lao Lu said this, he was already walking down the stairs and getting closer to Jongwon. Jongwon felt more and more panicked as she watched the people walking over. Not from the high school, but from the junior high school, right? Old Lu looked at Jongwon sharply. Jongwon nodded bravely. What are you doing in the high school? Lao Lu asked. Teacher, I said I went to the wrong place. Do you believe it? Jongwon lowered his head and wrung his hands together nervously. Lao Lu snorted coldly. Do you think I should believe it? Jongwon laughed dryly hee a few times. What are you doing in the high school? He asked again. Sending food to my brother. Jongwon thought for a few seconds and came up with the reason. Your brother? Which class is your brother in? He seemed to want to catch Jongwon and break the casserole to ask the truth. Jongwon sighed inwardly. It seemed that he couldn't escape. Grade 2, Class 2, Senior High School, Jongwon said truthfully. In any case, he just looks familiar and does not really know her. It should be fine if she says so. Lao Lu nodded thoughtfully. Okay, let's go. He waved his hand and did not continue to ask. This surprised Jongwon. She stood there and forgot to leave for a while. Old Lu glared at her. What are you doing? Still not leaving? Let's go now. See you, teacher, Jongwon said and ran away. She also thought it was better not to ask because Lao Lu would ask her brother's name again, so that she could get away easily. Lao Lu stood upstairs and looked down at the playground, watching the little figures hurriedly running away on the playground, and then looked back at the classroom behind him with a helpless expression. Jongwon slumped down in his seat after returning to the classroom. He didn't feel his legs were weak when he ran just now. When he ran up and sat down, he realized that his legs were so weak. Jongwon, you are too cowardly, she muttered to herself, hating the iron. What's the matter? There's no time yet. Sujiao walked up behind Jongwon without noticing and raised his hand to glance at his watch. Jongwon was panting heavily, and there was a lot of sweat on her forehead. She opened her mouth and said intermittently, I met old Lutiu, one of the three giants. Sujiao was no longer calm now. He opened his mouth wide and asked in surprise, what's wrong with him? End of this chapter. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 374. Chapter 374 Guilty Conscience. I didn't do anything at all. I just went to deliver food to Luz's who. Suddenly, I was a little scared when I met him, and I felt guilty. Jongwon was still breathing heavily. Now I think about that scene and I still feel frightened. Lao Lu said that she always felt like she was finished when she looked familiar. Why are you so brave and dare to run over to deliver food? Old Lu likes to hang out in the high school department the most. Didn't you catch him? Su Jiao frowned and stood aside to calm down Jongwon. No, but, I guess I doubt it, Jongwon said and leaned on the table in annoyance. I should have known better than to take the risk. If they continue like this, they will be discovered sooner or later, so it is better to keep a low profile, and they still need to study. It's good that we haven't discovered it yet. There is still a chance. Keep a low profile in the future, Su Jiao comforted her. Jongwon nodded, having no choice but to keep a low profile. Don't think about it now, I guess you don't have your mobile phone with you, Su Jiao said. Jongwon nodded, indeed not. What's wrong? She asked. Is it okay for you to have dinner with Zhang Baihui on Saturday? Jongwon thought for a while and said, no problem. Okay, remember to take Brother Lu with you, Su Jiao said and winked at her. Jongwon was speechless for a moment. Actually, Brother Lu is quite interesting, he Chiu, and I suddenly discovered that he is not that scary, Su Jiao explained. Jongwon nodded. Lu's who wasn't that scary in the first place, but his always cold face gave people the impression that he was not easy to get along with. Actually, Jongwon didn't know that Lu's who gave all his tenderness to her. Speaking of He Chiu, why hasn't he come yet? Su Jiao raised her hand and looked at her watch. Class was about to start this time. You must be late, this guy. I just like to see him being late for training, Su Jiao said and looked at the time, said hello to Jongwon and returned to his seat. Not long after she sat down, Jongwon told her again, remember to decide on the place, not just the time. Don't worry, it's not a big deal, Su Jiao said and made an okay gesture. The school is relatively calm, and the whole school is filled with an active atmosphere of young girls and boys. The atmosphere on the other side is obviously different. The atmosphere in the cake shop dropped from the lively atmosphere the moment Tang Yu came in with a cold face, and all the employees who were still lively fell silent. They are all doing their own thing seriously at their posts, for fear that they will be scolded by Tang Yu if they make mistakes or make mistakes. Actually, they were not like this before. The way they used to get along with Tang Yu was to play around, at least they were much more active than now. But since Tang Yu's temperament changed drastically and he got angry at every turn, they were afraid, and no one dared to joke with Tang Yu anymore. The only remaining identities between them are serious boss and migrant workers. Tang Yu walked in and saw everyone looking scared, but felt a sense of suffocation. She covered her chest and said nothing, and walked to the small table in the corner to sit down. She sat there for a while. A car pulled up to the door of the cake shop. It was a familiar car. Tang Yu knew that Lin 11 was coming. As she expected, he would probably complain to her again when he came in soon for not staying at home well, and maybe even ask her to leave early. But this time Tang Yu didn't want to go back early because she wanted to devote herself to work so that she wouldn't think about other things that would affect her. Just as he was thinking about Lin 11 pushing the door open, the employees raised their heads when they saw her, their eyes full of excitement, as if they were saying finally, we've waited for her. Lin 11 sighed inwardly and walked towards Tang Yu who was sitting in the corner. End of this chapter. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yun. Chapter 375. Chapter 375 The reason why it remains unchanged for thousands of years. Didn't I tell you to have a good rest? Why didn't you listen? Lin 11 asked. I'm afraid you won't be able to handle it yourself, Tang Yu said with a slight smile. She has always had this reason, and it will remain unchanged for thousands of years. I'm too lazy to talk about you, Lin 11 said angrily, but after thinking about it carefully, She couldn't help but talk to her, so she wanted to nag a few more words. Tang Yu saw her intention. Lin 11 opened her mouth before Tang Yu hurriedly stopped her. Don't try to persuade me. You know I can't take any time off. As for what you said about going out to relax, I have already thought about it. I will go with An in a few days, so don't worry about me, Tang Yu said. Lin 11 was slightly surprised. However, she felt relieved when she heard Tang Yu say that he would go out to play in a few days. Remember what you said today, or I will kidnap you out, Lin 11 pretended to threaten her. Tang Yu smiled and nodded helplessly. Since she promised Zhang Wanan, she would definitely do it. It was for Zhang Wanan's sake and for her own sake. She did know that she should go out for a walk. The city is very stressful, why not go to a quiet place to relax and relax? Perhaps all the troubles will be purified by nature after coming back. Thinking about it, Tang Yu felt a little happy. She stood up, picked up her bag, pointed inside and said, I'm going back to the office first. You can go to the flower shop today. I'll get off work on time. Lin 11 saw that she was in a good mood and said nothing. She just sat for a while, observed the situation, took her bag and left. The flower shop cannot be separated from people. Recently, she has been focusing on the dessert shop. The flower shop does not have much control. It is time to go back and take a look. On the other side, school. Anan, Jiangbei Huai said we would meet at the wonton shop after class. Su Jiao came over and said. Zhang Wanan frowned slightly and asked, is it his mother's shop? I didn't say, but he said you know that store. Does his mother own a store? Su Jiao was a little curious. She had never heard Zhang Baihui talk about it. Zhang Wanan nodded. Since she said she knew, it was Zhang Baihui's mother's shop. Without thinking much, Zhang Wanan immediately agreed and said he would take everyone there on that day. Actually, she couldn't remember the route, because it was in an alley and tortuous, so it wouldn't be a bad thing to take Lu Zizhu with him. Judging from his memory, he would definitely still remember it. Why hasn't your Hichiu come yet? Have you asked for leave? Zhang Wanan raised her eyebrows and asked Su Jiao. Su Jiao blushed instantly. What nonsense are you talking about? He belongs to your family and mine. I don't know if he comes or not. I don't care. You really don't care? Zhang Wanan looked at her suspiciously. Su Jiao nodded vigorously, then turned back to his seat without saying anything. After returning, Zhang Wanan clearly saw Su Jiao playing with his mobile phone under the table. She turned on the brightness so high that Zhang Wanan could see it clearly. It was clearly the chat interface between her and Hichiu. I saw Su Jiao typing and deleting and typing. He hesitated not to send it out and didn't know what he was thinking. Obviously they care, but they are so talkative and have no idea what these little enemies are doing. Bright, Zhang Wanan shouted. Su Jiao responded and looked back at her with a confused expression. Can I do it for you? Zhang Wanan said mischievously. Su Jiao looked at the screen of her phone and then at Zhang Wanan. Only then did she realize that her little thoughts had been seen through. She blushed and did not talk to Zhang Wanan. Zhang Wanan suddenly felt in a good mood after teasing Su Jiao, but she quickly remembered Lu Zizhu and didn't know what he was doing now. I don't know if Avril is still standing by his side and so close to him. I don't know if Avril has chased suitors for Lu Zizhu anymore. I don't know if Avril has ever confidently said, Lu Zizhu is mine. End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yun. Chapter 376. Chapter 376. There is a problem with food. Thinking about Zhang Wanan, I felt itchy and uncomfortable in my heart, and I really wanted to run over and have a look. In the past, if you were not in the same school, you would want to grow up and go to the same school as him. But now, the same school is divided into a junior high school and a high school. Even though this was the case, she was not satisfied anymore. She wanted to be in the same class with him and be his desk mate. Thinking of this, Jongwon turned to look at her desk mate, thinking that it would be great if Luzes was here. He could see it when he turned around and be within reach, so that he wouldn't think too much about it. And the other side. Luzes felt uncomfortable in his stomach all morning. He went to the toilet several times in pain and was lying on the table in exhaustion. There were several people surrounding him. "Squad leader, can't you go to the hospital? You can't keep doing this," someone advised. "Yes, it hurts just looking at it." "Stop holding it back, go to the hospital." Luzes clutched his stomach tightly and could not speak. "Is there something wrong with the food that the girl delivered this morning?" A voice from the surrounding area reached Luzes' ears. In fact, the man was very cautious when he said this, for fear that Luzes would be angry. He was almost cautious when he said this, and even did not dare to take a breath after saying it. But who knew that no matter how careful Luzes was, he would still get angry. Luzes looked up with a pale face and stared at him fiercely. After a while, he gritted his teeth and said two words, "Shut up." As expected, the boy didn't speak anymore, closed his mouth and walked aside. Luzes wondered why there was something wrong with the food Jongwon sent. The wontons he sent last time were all fine. It couldn't be such a coincidence, right? It must have happened because he wasn't paying attention. Maybe the patience will pass. Everyone looked at him and couldn't persuade him. They all shook their heads helplessly. Luzes would be as stubborn as a cow when his temper got hot. No one dared to go up and persuade him, for fear that if he failed to persuade him, he would get angry. Everyone looked at me and I looked at you, and finally our eyes fell on Avril not far away. Avril has been pretending to talk to a few girls not far away. In fact, she has been observing the situation here. When she saw the looks of help from those people, she clenched her fists hard. After a few seconds, she raised her feet and reached out to push aside the few people blocking her and walked over. She reached out and patted Luzes on the shoulder and said, "Go to the hospital, don't hold on." Luzes didn't hear anything and said nothing. "Go find the teacher." Avril didn't care whether he agreed or not at this moment, and directly ordered the people around to call the teacher. Seeing that Luzes had no objection, someone walked to the office. "We will go to the hospital when the teacher comes soon. Don't hold on any longer. You shouldn't eat at the roadside stall. You." "Shut up," Avril was scolded before she could finish her words. Avril knew she was wrong, but she felt that she was not wrong. If Luzes hadn't eaten from the roadside stall bought by Jongwon, he wouldn't be like this. Why did she feel distressed just by talking about Luzes? Avril clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her flesh and she didn't feel any pain. She was already numb. I don't know what kind of enchanting soup that little girl Jongwon gave Luzes, and she actually asked Luzes to protect her at all times. And he still wanted to protect her even though it was obviously her fault. At this moment, even if the pain is like this, I don't want to go to the hospital. The teacher came over with a frown on hearing the sound. He saw Luzes lying on the table and started to panic. He walked over and looked around without saying anything, then asked someone to carry Luzes on his back while he went to call an ambulance. Looking at Luzes current state, the infirmary should be busy at the moment. Just at this moment, Gu Jinsha jumped out of nowhere. He ran away after class and didn't even see Luzes like this. When he came in, he panicked when he saw him, pushed aside everyone and ran over. End of this chapter. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 377. Chapter 377, Paper can't contain the fire. Brother, What's wrong with you? Gu Jinchu pushed through the crowd and walked in, and saw Luzes who was pale and sweating on his forehead. He seemed to have lost the strength to speak and was exhausted. Avril snorted coldly and said with a bad expression, "Maybe the breakfast was poisonous." Luzes raised his head when he heard Avril's voice and glanced at her coldly. Even though he was sick, Avril was still a little timid when Luzes looked at her. She couldn't help but take a few steps back and didn't dare to speak again. Luzes was simply too protective of Zhang. "I've called a taxi and it'll be here in a moment." After the teacher finished speaking, he stood there at a loss and turned around anxiously. "Luzes, what did you eat this morning?" the teacher couldn't help but ask, remembering how Avril Lavigne mentioned breakfast several times just now. "Food," Luzes replied coldly. The teacher knew Luzes temper and knew that he was very irritable right now, so he didn't ask any more questions. The head teacher told the principal about Luzes, and the principal hurried over after knowing about it. After all, everyone knew how important Luzes was to the school, and the entire school relied on him for glory. If something happens to him, the school will regret it to death. But the principal came and didn't recruit anyone, he was just in a hurry. Not long after, the ambulance roared in. When the sound of the ambulance was heard, the whole school exploded. They thought something had happened. For a while, the upper and lower floors were blocked just to see who had the accident. Some people who liked to join in the fun even ran to the ambulance. The medical staff quickly ran upstairs carrying a stretcher, and then laid Luzes flat on the stretcher. Cover my face with something to block me. I don't want the school to be in an uproar when I come back." Luzes held his stomach and frowned, and managed to say a word. "How long have you been paying attention to your image?" the principal couldn't help scolding him. Luzes smiled bitterly and called out to Gu Jinchu. Gu Jinchu clearly took a thin piece of paper and gently covered his face. The doctor turned his head and glanced, seeing that it was just a thin piece of paper. He didn't say anything. Actually, what Luzes was paying attention to was not his image, nor was he afraid of the uproar in the school. He was afraid that the little girl would be anxious if she found out about it. Who would comfort her if she cried and he wasn't around? He knew why he had a stomachache this time. How could he not know that there was something wrong with the food in the morning? But he just didn't want others to talk about the little girl. It would be so sad for the little girl to hear it. It was obviously kind of her to bring him breakfast, but in the end, she ended up doing something like this. The little girl would definitely blame herself to death if she knew about it. But how can paper cover the fire? Zhang Wanan on the opposite floor also heard the commotion outside, but because there were too many people, she couldn't squeeze in front. She sighed slightly and suddenly realized why she wanted to join in the fun. So she turned around and walked towards the classroom. "Anan, I'm curious about what's going on outside," Su Jiao said depressedly, leaning on the table with her face in her hands. "There are too many people. There are 3 floors inside and 3 outside. We can't squeeze in or get out. How do we know what's going on outside? It's better to stay in the classroom." Zhang Wanan was equally depressed. But she thought Luzes would know about it, but if she thought about it carefully, Luzes was the kind of person who meddles in other people's business. She probably wouldn't care about it, and maybe he was still studying seriously in the classroom. It's okay if you don't know. Anyway, you definitely don't know the person who caused the accident, and it has nothing to do with you. Just as he was thinking about this, an urgent voice came. Zhang Wanan heard carefully that the voice was calling her. When she turned around, she found He Chiu standing outside the door. "Are you willing to come to school?" Su Jiao was the first to react and look at him. She thought this guy wouldn't come today. End of this chapter. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yun. Chapter 378. Chapter 378. She came late. "Are you willing to come to school?" Su Jiao was the first to react and look at him. She thought this guy wouldn't come today. He Chiu nodded, but did not have time to explain. He dragged the crowd all the way up not just for chatting, but because he had something important to say. He stood at the door and took a few breaths before running to Zhang Wanan. Zhang Wanan was about to tease him a few words, but what He Chiu said next made her mind go blank and even a little unbelievable. Luzes who was in an accident and was taken to an ambulance, He Chiu pointed outside anxiously. He happened to see that scene when he first arrived, so he went over to take a look out of curiosity, and then he saw Gu Jinchu running anxiously behind the stretcher. He suddenly ran over to catch up with Gu Jinchu and asked, "Brother Jinchu, who is on the stretcher?" The person on the stretcher did not show his face, but he felt familiar from the face down, especially when he saw Gu Jinchu following behind, so he became even more curious. Gu Jinchu saw that He Chiu obviously didn't expect him to appear here. Just when he was about to explain, the face of the person lying on the stretcher was exposed. A little wind picked up the covering on Luzes Hu's face and was blown away by the wind. Now Gu Jinchu didn't need to explain, and He Chiu could see clearly the person on the stretcher. He Chiu was dumbfounded when he saw the person on the stretcher clearly. He ran towards the teaching building without having time to say anything more, and finally reached the classroom after breaking through the human walls. Zhang Wanan obviously couldn't believe it after receiving the news. Just now she thought that this matter was none of her business and she didn't need to worry about it, but now she was told that the person she didn't want to worry about was Luzes Hu. Her mind went blank and she even felt a little dizzy. Why is Luzes Hu in the ambulance? What's up with him? Zhang Wanan couldn't help but ask herself. How would you know the answer if you didn't look at her? So she stood up from her chair and ran outside quickly, followed by Sujiaojiao and He Chiu. There were so many people watching along the way that the road was blocked. I don't know who the loudmouth got the news. Suddenly, the news about Luzes Hu's accident spread among the crowd. Some people who had been hiding in the classroom and did not come out now came out one after another. It should have taken less than a minute to run down, but this time Zhang Wanan felt that the walk was too long. She was pushing each other with others in the crowd. He Chiu and Sujiaojiao also helped her clear the way, and she finally got downstairs. But when I went downstairs, I found that the ambulance had already roared away. She still came down late. If she had joined in the fun from the beginning, she might have been able to catch up, but she didn't. Zhang Wanan didn't think about anything else at the time. Her first thought was to chase the ambulance. But how could she catch up with a four-wheeled vehicle on just two legs? In the blink of an eye, the ambulance disappeared before his eyes. Enan, Enan. Sujiaojiao and He Chiu ran after her, calling her from behind as if they were spirits. Zhang Wanan stopped. She stood there dumbfounded and was at a loss. He Chiu and Sujiaojiao ran forward and stood beside Zhang Wanan like bodyguards on the left and right, for fear that she would lose control of her emotions. But Zhang Wanan was unusually calm. She took a deep breath to persuade herself to calm down and asked, "Do you know what's going on?" she was asking He Chiu. He Chiu shook his head. When he saw that the person on the stretcher was Luzes Hu, he ran up without thinking about anything and did not have time to understand the situation in depth. Zhang Wanan said nothing more and just nodded. "You guys go back and help me ask for leave from the head teacher. I'll go out for a while," Zhang Wanan said and walked toward the door without looking back. Enan Sujiaojiao hurriedly stepped forward and grabbed Zhang Wanan's arm. End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yun. Chapter 379. Chapter 379. A complete sand sculpture. Zhang Wanan ignored her and didn't even slow down her pace. She dragged Sujiaojiao along with her, as if she didn't notice anyone grabbing her. Enan Sujiaojiao called her again. Zhang Wanan was finally willing to stop. She looked back at Sujiao, who was waiting for her to speak. Sujiao sighed and said, I know you are anxious, but if you go out carelessly like this, something will happen. Hichayu has already gone back to the class teacher to ask for leave. Can I go with you? I will accompany you, Sujiao said seriously. Look at her and say. Zhang Wanan stared at Sujiao seriously, and then felt a soreness in her nose. She nodded, and then the two of them walked towards the door together, but as soon as they reached the door, something new happened. The guard refused to let me out. Zhang Wanan was about to explain, but before she could open her mouth, she was stopped by Sujiao. She said, Don't worry, let's wait for a while and wait for Hichayu to come with the leave note from the teacher. Then we can go out. Don't worry, be anxious, Sujiao coaxed patiently. Zhang Wanan really didn't have the patience to wait any longer, but he couldn't force his way in, so he had to walk around impatiently until a car stopped in front of the two of them. The person in the driver's seat and the person sitting in the back seat opened the windows at the same time. They were slightly startled to see that it was the head teacher and Hichayu. Get in the car, what are you doing standing around? The class teacher in the driver's seat scolded. Sujiao and Zhang Wanan came to their senses and quickly got into the car. It turned out that the head teacher was here to take them to the hospital. Sujiao, who was sitting in the car, glanced at Hichayu. Unexpectedly, this kid was so good that when he asked him to ask for leave from the teacher, he actually moved the teacher out and drove them there. Don't tell me it feels pretty cool. Hichayu felt the adoring gaze of Sujiao when he looked at him. He turned to look at Sujiao and smiled at her and said, Don't be obsessed with me, he is just a legend. Sujiao felt nauseous and thought that Hichayu would be better off not talking. He would start to make silly sentences when he spoke, which was not normal at all. At least when he didn't speak, he gave people the impression of a quiet handsome man. And the opening is a complete sand sculpture. The old man ignored the two people bickering in the back, and just glanced at Zhang Wanan worriedly in the rearview mirror. The little girl looked uneasy at the moment, and her hands were rubbing together nervously. However, he couldn't help but want to say a few words. You still want to ask for leave and go on your own, you probably don't even know where the hospital is. Once you get anxious, you don't have any brains, so you just worry blindly. After the old man finished speaking, Zhang Wanan realized that it was exactly what the old man said. She did not know which hospital loses who would be sent to. At that time, she was only anxious and thought about running out to catch up with the ambulance. Nothing came to mind. Thinking about Zhang Wanan, she scratched her head in embarrassment, but still sincerely thanked the old man. The old man was still angry and snorted arrogantly and ignored her. In fact, he was also anxious. When he heard the news, he must have been in the same mood as Zhang Wanan, but he was probably much calmer than Zhang Wanan. At least he knew to call and ask the hospital where the principal loses who went. The people in the car were silent except for each other's breathing. I don't know how loses who is doing now. The other side. The ambulance has roared to the hospital, and the medical staff rolled the bed and sent loses who for examination. Loses who's head teacher and principal followed the ambulance to the hospital and were waiting anxiously. Taking advantage of this time, the head teacher called Lin 11 to inform her to come to the hospital. At the same time, Lin 11 and Lu Lin drove to the hospital in their cars. At the entrance of the hospital, two cars drove in one after the other. End of this chapter. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yun. Chapter 380. Chapter 380 Food Poisoning. Then the people in the car rushed into the hospital at the same time. In just one glance, Lin 11 and Lu Lin saw Zhang Wanan, and Zhang Wanan also saw the two people. Dad, Mom. Enan. Enan. Three voices sounded at the same time and overlapped. The mother and daughter came together, and Lu Lin ran inside first. Lin 11 saw the old man when she walked over and took Zhang Wanan's hand. She smiled and greeted the old man politely, "Teacher Li, we meet again." She often goes to parent-teacher conferences for Luz's Who, so she is very familiar with the old man. The old man nodded and smiled at her. Without exchanging too much greetings, the group of people hurriedly walked into the hospital. After all, there was still a person lying in the hospital, and they had to go and check on the situation as soon as possible. "Why are you here?" Lin 11 held Zhang Wanan's hand and asked as he hurried away. "Xiao Jojo came here because I was worried thanks to the teacher who drove us here, and they were also worried so they came with me," Zhang Wanan said and looked at the old man, "Su Qiao Qiao and He Chiu." Lin 11 thanked the old man again. The old man waved his hand and said, "It's okay, they are all my students." Lin 11 thanked him and looked at Su Qiao Qiao and He Chiu. "Thank you too for coming to accompany Anan. Come to Auntie's house for dinner another day." Lin 11 sincerely invited Su Qiao Qiao and He Chiu. She has an impression of these two people. Zhang Wanan is a good friend and has been to their house before, so she has a deep impression. Su Qiao Qiao and He Chiu were flattered and nodded hurriedly. "I wonder how Xiao Jojo is doing." Zhang Wanan was a little worried. Lin 11 shook her head. She didn't know the situation, so she still had to wait and see. The group of people walked to where Luz's Who was now. As soon as Lin 11 went there, he saw Luz's Who's current class teacher and principal, who were talking to Lu Lin at the moment. She also pulled Zhang Wanan over and said, "Sorry to bother you, I'm so busy and I still have to worry about you." The head teacher and the principal waved their hands hurriedly, thinking that there was nothing wrong with this. Luz's Who was now the school's mascot. If something happened to the mascot, they would naturally come, otherwise they would not be sincere. "Have the test results come out?" Lin 11 looked at Lu Lin. Lu Lin walked quickly. He had been here for a while and understood the situation clearly. He nodded and said, "I have food poisoning and I am undergoing gastric lavage." "Food poisoning? How could you get food poisoning?" Lin 11 felt a little incredible. Zhang Wanan was a little flustered when he heard the words food poisoning, and the little hand held by Lin 11 suddenly became sweaty. "I thought that Luz's Who's stomach and intestines had always been healthy. Could it be that the problem was caused by his breakfast?" As expected, the test results showed that Luz's Who was admitted to the hospital because of her breakfast. "Mom, I bought breakfast for Xiao Jojo at the school gate this morning," Zhang Wanan confessed proactively. Because Luz's Who didn't eat in the morning, he only ate the breakfast he bought himself, so this is the reason. "Huh?" Lin 11 was slightly surprised. Zhang Wanan nodded and explained what happened. Lin 11 understood clearly that Luz's Who was fine now, and Zhang Wanan didn't do it on purpose, so he shouldn't blame her. "It's okay, Anan. It's not your fault. Just pay attention next time. Xiao Jojo is fine, don't worry." Lin 11 comforted the little girl for fear that she would blame herself. Just as Luz's Who was being pushed out, he had finished washing his stomach and it was time to return to the ward. "Need to stay for a few days for observation." Zhang Wanan felt heartbroken when she saw the person being pushed out. The person lying on the bed was frowning. His face was pale and a little weak. If he hadn't eaten the food she bought, he wouldn't be like this, Zhang Wanan thought. How could she not blame herself when it was obviously caused by herself? "I'm sorry, Xiao Jojo." After entering the ward, Zhang Wanan apologized softly in front of the hospital bed. End of this chapter.